it was wonderful to hear from everyone, particularly on all the historical context that everyone has provided, and kind of the current conditions. So I want to depart from that point, and from something that Carlos actually just mentioned around the changes in the current conditions, and talk a little bit as well about Black Alliance for Peace, about BAP's work in Haiti and in the Americas. So I think the question of the Summit of the Americas versus CELAC is an important one right now, particularly because I believe, as Carlos mentioned, although the Democrats in power right now in the U.S. may take a different approach to Latin America and the Caribbean, the goal is the same, of expansion of U.S. imperialism, through slightly different tactics. And we see that across a myriad of different ways. So you see that the OAS and the OAS-sponsored Summit of the Americas, continued consolidation of both economic and military power there. You see the core group, which has been very active in Haiti, in the recent renewal of the UN mandate in Haiti, which is supported by the U.S., strongly supported and run by the U.S. And you'll see the expansion of SOUTHCOM, U.S. Southern Command, in the region, and the increased militarization in the region. And this is something as BAP that we, as an anti-militaristic coalition, that we are very concerned about and doing a lot of work on, and to draw attention to SOUTHCOM. And for those who may not know, the U.S. military divides the world up into different zones. So we talk about AFRICOM, which is obviously the U.S. African Command, which was expanded a lot under Obama, and we've now, in addition, begun to talk a lot about SOUTHCOM, which is growing. And what's important there's a lot to say, but what I'll say first, and kind of the most important areas, is that SOUTHCOM, the U.S. has used sort of the idea of disaster preparedness, the climate crisis, and regional integration in order to increasingly militarize the region. We see this is tied to U.S. war, supported wars in Ukraine, the U.S. war in previous war in Afghanistan, police brutality in the 1033 program in the U.S. at home, and the kind of colonization and the brutalization of African communities in the U.S., as well as the militarization of the region. Right? And so what SOUTHCOM has done is not only expanded its operations, but also tried to consolidate the other countries in the Caribbean, in the Caribbean basin, in Central America as well, to do things like Operation Trade Winds, which are military exercise that happen throughout the Caribbean every single year, as well as more recent program called Sentinel Watch, which has taken place in Guatemala and Honduras, and is also co-sponsored by USAID. A lot of these things are under the guise of aid programs and, like I said, disaster preparedness, but have the ultimate goal of kind of changing the conditions of neocolonialism or imperialism in the region and increase militarization throughout the region. And one of the hardest things with that, and I think I really appreciated, Arnold, for your kind of historical context here and the importance of understanding mass movement versus any specific leaders, is that, in doing this, the U.S. has brought in partners, particularly the larger countries in the region, Mexico, Brazil, and others, to try to support militarization in the Caribbean and throughout the region, under the guise of security, right, and security forces. And we see that as well with the U.S. With the UN mission in Haiti, and the mission in Haiti and the support of other countries. And we sort of called that out in a letter to AMLO in Mexico last month, to not support the ongoing, neocolonialization of Haiti that the U.S. has continued to push as a response to, violence in the region. And so we know that while, we support kind of the progressive forces in the region, we also have to watch that the way that the U.S. is trying to, mold things in the future, and an adaptation of the Monroe Doctrine is to kind of bring in junior partners into imperialism throughout the region, right? And to join in that, particularly in the Caribbean. And I really, really thank Camila for the bringing the Caribbean into this space, because I think as we talk about human rights and the importance of human rights, at the Black Alliance for Peace, we talk about people-centered human rights, right, which are defined as emanating from bottom-up mass struggle, informed by a Black revolutionary and feminist intersectional framework. And what's really important there is not only thinking, not throwing out the entire understanding of human rights, but adding context to the liberal and European kind of colonial conception of human rights, which has been weaponized against the oppressed throughout the region, and taking that understanding that human rights are an arena of struggle. And when it's grounded and informed by the needs and aspirations of the oppressed, that they can be a way and a strategy for decolonization, radical social change. And so thinking about that, we kind of enter the Black Alliance for Peace, we enter the region and through the context of Haiti, because we understand that Haiti has been a crucial point for Pan-African liberation and anti-colonial struggle since 1791, in the initial revolt against slavery, through the aiding of Simon Bolivar and through the aiding of other revolutionaries throughout the hemisphere. Haiti has also been demonized throughout the region as a way to kind of stifle anti-colonial and anti-slavery revolts throughout the region, particularly when we think of Cuba and sort of the way that Cuba's revolutions in the past were racialized for fear of another Haiti, as well as in the US. So we understand that Haiti has a critical historical role in the region, but it's not just about history, right? We also understand that Haiti is critical to the transformation of the Americas as part of a global and anti-colonial revolutionary project, and the revolutionary Pan-African movement. And so Haiti is our entry point, and we've been doing work as a Haiti Americans team, as a committee, and then a team since the beginning of 2001, and know that it's critical for Black liberation as well as the liberation of people through a Black working class struggle. And that's just as true now as it was, in the past, as it was under, French colonialism, under US military occupation, under the Duvalier dictatorship, and now currently under, UN occupation. And so what that kind of allows us to focus on in Haiti is both solidarity with Haiti and throughout the broader Caribbean. As I mentioned earlier, we sort of called for AMLO to reconsider the position in support of the UN mandate in Haiti, as well as just kind of calling for other regional formations, CARICOM and others who sort of look to Haiti and the violence that is happening right now in Haiti, which coincidentally, seems to increase every time another UN mandate is awarded there. We understand that in the region, and thinking about Haiti, that it is critical. It's a critical place of imperial exploitation. It's a critical way for the U.S. to bring in other partners, from France, from England, the UN, as well as in the broader region, under sort of under this imperialist logic, right, and under this imperialist project. So we really have to be careful and understand that while the Monroe Doctrine is changing, the U.S. has no goal, has no idea of letting that go. And if we ignore Haiti, and if we don't understand that Haiti is critical to the region, we run the risk of allowing that. And so what do we say beyond, support for Haiti, and what do we say beyond the support for solidarity in the region? We at the Black Alliance for Peace are calling for a zone of peace in the region. And that may sound familiar to some of you all who are familiar with CELAC, because CELAC called for sort of a governmental zone of peace in a sort of a government level zone of peace with progressive forces in 2014, as a way to, as a way to understand the need for anti-imperialism in the region, and to fight against what Carlos mentioned of this project of the U.S. imperialist project, right? And so what we are calling for, though, is not a zone of peace only looking at the pink tide, only looking at progressive governmental forces, but understanding from the bottom up, right? Understanding the civil society zone of peace, and understanding that we, as organizations here in the region, as civil society organizations, as people that want to be in solidarity with folks in the region, that we have to struggle for peace, in alternative structures as well, right? And that means fighting against nuclear proliferation, fighting against arms sales, in the region and fighting against, all the intrusive actions of Southcom and other structures. And so the call for a zone of peace is a call for peoples and nations of the Caribbean and Latin America to resist. We understand that people want peace, and we understand that a zone of peace means ending foreign military presence and bases in the Caribbean throughout the region, as well as in all structures and practices of regional militarization. So through BAP, we intend to build a region-wide coalition to push warmongers out of the region. And we have to understand that this zone of peace is critical. And when we talk about peace, we know that by the Black radical peace tradition, peace is not the absence of conflict, but the achievement by popular struggle and defense of a world liberated from nuclear armaments and proliferation, unjust war, and global white supremacy. We understand that this must come from the bottom up, and we encourage it to be supported by progressive forces in the region that do have power and are able to be in solidarity with the peoples and have that focus on mass movement, whether it's here in the US, whether it's in Nicaragua, in Colombia. We have to understand in Cuba, we have to understand that all of it comes back to the people. It needs to be informed by the needs and desires and the ability of people to struggle in the region. Yeah, I'll follow up with Ben's comment just now on the question that was just asked. I think it is an important opportunity to think about, the kind of the plurinational state, to think about different alternative structures of governance, alternative understanding of human rights, the rights of the earth, and as you will, however you call it, right? Whether it's Buen Vivir, Vivir Sabroso in Colombia, and other things. I think it's critical that we kind of embrace this understanding of different ways of forming government and consensus, and different ways of understanding people's needs and rights. But also we have to understand that we, can't just look at things like, there's Ley 70 in Colombia that, gives rights to Afro-Colombian peoples and land, and it's an important opportunity, but we can't stop there, right? Everything that we focus on, and I think Laura had mentioned this as well, must be rooted in sort of the working class and the needs and the needs and the material kind of conditions of the working class across the board, right? And not a working class that we kind of say and just give a broad kind of sweeping, understanding that's just based maybe on income or things like that, but also a strong understanding of the way that oppression happens, right? And the way that throughout the Americas and throughout the world, and the domination of U.S. imperialism and global capitalism, right? And so understanding, taking that framing of the working class, the needs of the working class in the Americas is critical, and the oppressed classes in the Americas from a racial and ethnic standpoint, and gender as well, I think is a critical point to all of these opportunities, right? Because if we think about that, then it's less about Boric, it's less about Petro in Francia and Colombia, it's less about AMLO, and it's more about how are we actually using those opportunities in the frameworks of any of these countries to kind of push forward mass movement and to push forward the understanding, and the work of mass movement on the ground, right? And so I think sort of in kind of closing, two things actually. I think Ben also brought up the kind of social chauvinist left, and I think that's really important to this question of the European left and the U.S. left, because it's very easy to stay in this realm of consolidating resources and power in NGOs from a nonprofit perspective, and kind of convince ourselves that through that we are going to get free, when we understand that is not the way to liberation, right? But the way to liberation is through building mass movement, right? It is through building coalition and building people power, right, throughout the region, right? And so we can't be kind of tempted by this idea that if we fund the right organizations, or if we work with the right foundations to have a 3-year strategy that can get $1 million, that's the way that we are going to get free, and that's the way that we're going to fight US imperialism in the region. Right. And so I think that that kind of all points to getting away from this white supremacist and global capitalist construct of the way that we think about struggle. That also means that while we can't just blindly follow leaders in the region just because they have, compelling rhetoric, we also have to understand that the way that violence happen, or not violence, but the way that for example, when you see people talking about anti-blackness in Cuba, the way that interpersonal anti-blackness happens is not the same as kind of the structural and historical racial segregation and violence and brutal exploitation that has been the history of the United States, right? And the history and the present of the United States. You can't look at that from a liberal lens and say just because there is some amount of anti-blackness in Cuba, that does not mean it's the same. Right, it's really critical that we kind of keep that framework, because while we know that there's still struggle to be had within the revolution in Cuba, it is not the same struggle that needs to take place in the U.S. Right, it is not the same foundational, in the U.S. it's a foundational understanding and creation of the U.S. That has kind of like propagated this white supremacist and capitalist exploitation. So the last thing I'll say is that we need to sort of ground all of this in what do people on the ground and what are movements on the ground and governments as well doing in the material realities of people. So, for example, at BAP, we kind of participated in an anti-imperialist summit in Los Angeles and against the Summit of the Americas, and tried to continue to build coalition, continue to speak out against the formations that are happening from an imperialist context. We participated in solidarity work in Nicaragua. We participated in kind of election work and ongoing things in Colombia. And so I think working with mass movement and building that relationship that is not a relationship of development, or not a relationship of an NGO, that has typically happened from the global north to the global south, but truly, relationships that are anti-imperialist and based in solidarity between peoples, and understand the material realities and conditions and how those conditions change over time, so that we can adapt and understand that while U.S. imperialism may change over time, the leaders of Western capital and global capital have no desire, they will adapt to any of the rhetoric that they need to adapt to, right? So we have to look beyond that and to actually make sure we're forming those relationships with people through an anti-imperialist framework.